I'm Martha, a 55-year-old Cherokee-Anglo woman, and I was brewing my morning herbal tea in my Texas ranch kitchen at exactly 5:47 a.m. when my eyes caught something disturbing. My husband Bose had been visiting that locked barn for precisely 127 consecutive nights at the same hour. My Cherokee intuition screamed warnings through my veins like wildfire. I approached the barn door to investigate its contents, but found it secured with 3 different locks I'd never seen before. I circled the building searching for another entrance, discovering boarded windows and reinforced walls instead. My hands trembled as I realized Bose was hiding something massive from me. To uncover the truth, I hesitantly decided to confront him directly about his nightly ritual. The moment I asked about the barn, Bose's face went completely pale and his jaw tightened with fear. What secrets was my husband hiding that were worth destroying our 23-year marriage? Have you ever discovered that the person you trusted most was living a double life right under your nose? Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have confronted him or opened that barn in secret? The first light of dawn crept through the kitchen window like a cautious animal, and I was already awake as I had been every morning for more years than I cared to count. My Cherokee grandmother used to say that sunrise was when the spirits whispered their secrets to those wise enough to listen. I pressed my palms together and spoke the old words in Cherokee, feeling the familiar comfort of my mother's language rolling off my tongue in this house where English ruled. Galv quodi hiyuha, I whispered. Thank you for this day. The cast iron stove had been cold when I rose, but now it radiated warmth as I prepared the morning tea. Not the bitter coffee that Bose preferred, but the healing blend my Cherokee kin had taught me: wild mint elderflower and a touch of willow bark. The herbs grew wild along the creek that bordered our land, and gathering them was one of the few times I felt truly connected to the part of me that this frontier world seemed determined to forget. Bose's boots thundered down the stairs, heavy and purposeful. At 60, he still moved like the young cowboy I'd married, all swagger and determination. But something had changed in recent months. His morning kisses had become distracted pecks, his conversations clipped and evasive. "Morning, Martha," he mumbled, reaching for his hat before he'd even properly looked at me. "The tea's ready," I offered, gesturing to the steaming cup I'd prepared. He paused, hat halfway to his head. "Can't today. Got business to tend to." Business. Always business these days? What kind of business requires you to be in that barn until all hours? His jaw tightened, a tell I'd learned to recognize over 2 decades of marriage. Ranch business. Nothing that concerns you. The words stung, but I kept my voice steady. This ranch concerns me plenty, Bose. I've worked this land beside you for 23 years. He softened slightly, crossing to kiss my forehead. I know you have, darling, but some things are better handled by men. There it was again, that dismissal wrapped in protection, that gentle pushing aside that had become as regular as sunrise. My Cherokee blood stirred restlessly. My grandmother had been a respected voice in tribal councils, her wisdom sought by chiefs and warriors alike. Yet here I stood, reduced to brewing tea and asking permission to understand my own life. After Bose left for the fields, I watched from the kitchen window as our daughter Charles rode up on her mare. At 28, she had inherited her father's determination and my Cherokee intuition, a combination that made her both formidable and occasionally reckless. She dismounted with fluid grace, her mixed heritage evident in the high cheekbones and dark hair that marked us both as belonging to 2 worlds simultaneously. "Morning, Mama," she called, but her eyes were fixed on something beyond the house. I followed her gaze and felt my blood chill. A rider sat motionless on the ridge overlooking our property, too distant to make out clearly, but close enough to feel threatening. He'd been there yesterday too, and the day before that. "You see him?" Charles asked quietly. "I see him." My voice was steadier than I felt. "Question is, what does he see in us?" Charles tied her horse to the post, her movements careful and deliberate. "Papa know about our watcher." I thought about Bose's evasiveness, his locked barn, his sudden secrecy about ranch business. If he does, he hasn't seen fit to tell me. I trusted my husband with my life for 23 years, but my Cherokee blood is screaming that something's wrong. When the man you love starts treating you like a stranger in your own home, do you honor the marriage or the instinct that's kept your people alive for generations? 3 days. That's all it took for the fever to consume the strongest man I'd ever known. Bose lay in our bed, his dark skin burning hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and labored. Doc Henderson had ridden out from town twice, shaking his gray head and muttering about how frontier medicine could only do so much against the mysterious ailments that swept through Texas like wildfire. "Keep him cool," Doc had instructed, his Scottish accent thick with frustration. "Willow bark tea if you can get it down him. Beyond that." He'd left the sentence hanging like smoke in still air. I'd been brewing willow bark tea for 3 generations of Cherokee women. My grandmother's remedies flowed through my hands as I pressed cool cloths to Bose's forehead and whispered healing songs in the old language. Charles sat vigil beside me, her mixed heritage evident in the way she seamlessly moved between my Cherokee methods and Doc Henderson's frontier medicine. "Mama," she whispered, "he's been asking for something. Keeps saying the papers over and over." I leaned closer to my husband's burning face. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something only he could see. "Bose, what papers, darling?" His hand gripped mine with surprising strength. "Martha, the barn. They can't know." His voice was barely a rasp, each word a struggle against the fever consuming him. "Can't know what?" I pressed, but his eyes had already drifted closed again. Charles and I exchanged glances. Those papers in the barn, the mysterious business that had consumed his evenings for months. Even now, dying, he was worried about protecting whatever secrets lay behind that locked door. As the sun set on the 3rd day, painting our bedroom walls the color of dried blood, Bose's breathing became more labored. I held his hand and sang the Cherokee death song my grandmother had taught me, the ancient words flowing like water over stones. Charles wept quietly beside me, her tears falling on work-worn hands that looked so much like mine at her age. "Martha," Bose whispered suddenly, his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "Promise me. Promise you won't go in there alone." "Go where?" I asked, though I already knew. "The barn. Promise me." The desperation in his voice chilled me more than his fever had. "Bose, what's in that barn?" But the clarity was already fading from his eyes. "Promise," he repeated, his grip weakening. "I promise," I lied, because sometimes love requires deception, and sometimes a woman knows that the promises she makes to dying men are meant to be broken. He smiled then, peaceful for the first time in days, and closed his eyes. An hour later, as the first stars appeared over our Texas sky, Bose drew his last breath. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the sudden emptiness of our bedroom. Charles sobbed openly now, her grief raw and unashamed. I held her close, my own tears falling silently as I whispered Cherokee prayers for the dead, asking the spirits to guide my husband safely to the next world. It wasn't until we were preparing his body for burial that I found a small brass key sewn into the lining of his vest pocket, hidden so carefully that only death could reveal it. The key was warm from his body heat, and when I closed my fingers around it, I could almost feel the weight of whatever secrets it was meant to protect. Charles saw me pocket it, but said nothing. We both knew what that key opened, and we both knew that despite my promise, that barn door wouldn't stay locked much longer. I promised my dying husband I wouldn't open that barn alone. But some promises are made to be broken when the truth might be the only thing that saves you. Have you ever lied to someone you loved to protect them, or was it really yourself you were protecting? The funeral guests had finally departed, leaving behind empty casserole dishes and the lingering scent of too many flowers. Charles was in the kitchen mechanically washing plates while tears still streaked her cheeks. The house felt hollow without Bose's presence, like a drum with no skin to give it voice. I stood at the kitchen window staring at that barn. The brass key felt heavy in my dress pocket, warm from my body heat and the weight of broken promises. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn's weathered boards, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to beckon me forward. "Mama," Charles appeared beside me, dish towel in her hands. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" "He's gone, Charles. Whatever he was protecting, it can't hurt him now." She nodded slowly. "But it might hurt us." Together, we walked across the dusty yard. My boots felt heavier with each step, as if the earth itself was trying to hold me back from whatever truth waited behind that locked door. The barn loomed larger than it ever had, its familiar red paint suddenly seeming ominous in the late afternoon light. The key turned easily in the lock as if it had been waiting for this moment. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo across the empty pasture. Inside the barn was nothing like I'd expected. Where I'd imagined hay bales and farming equipment, instead I found a makeshift office. A rough wooden table dominated the center space, covered with papers, maps, and ledger books. Oil lanterns hung from the rafters, their glass chimneys blackened from countless nights of use. This was where Bose had spent his evenings not tending cattle but hunched over documents by lamplight. "Sweet Jesus," Charles whispered, stepping deeper into the barn. "Mama, look at all this." The papers were organized with military precision. Land deeds, surveyor reports, correspondence tied with string. My hands trembled as I picked up the first document, a surveyor's map of our property, but with strange markings I didn't recognize. Red X's marked various points along our boundaries, and notes in Bose's handwriting covered the margins. "Railroad easement potential," I read aloud. "Water rights disputed. Mineral survey pending." Charles lifted a stack of letters, her dark eyes widening as she scanned the contents. "Mama, these are from the Texas Land Development Company. They're talking about buying our ranch." My blood turned cold. "Buying it? This land has been in your father's family for 15 years. We're not selling." But as I read further, the horrible truth began to emerge. The letters weren't inquiries about purchasing our land, they were negotiations. Detailed discussions about property values, railroad access, and something called relocation assistance for current occupants. Current occupants. I repeated the words, tasting bitter in my mouth. "That's what they call us. Not owners, not family, occupants." Charles found another bundle of papers, these ones official-looking with government seals. "Mama, these are from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're talking about your Cherokee heritage, about whether mixed blood families can legally own property in Texas." The barn seemed to spin around me. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white against the rough wood. "What are they saying?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "They're questioning our right to this land, saying that since you're part Cherokee and I'm your daughter, we might not have legal standing to inherit property from Papa." I sank onto a wooden crate, the weight of discovery crushing down on me like a collapsed roof. For months, Bose had been meeting with land developers and government officials, discussing our future as if we were livestock to be relocated. The man who'd promised to love and protect me had been planning to sell our home out from under us, abandon the life we'd built together. "There's more," Charles said quietly, holding up a final document. This one was in Bose's handwriting, a letter addressed to the Texas Land Development Company. "Dear Sirs," she read, "I am prepared to accept your offer of $3,000 for the property contingent upon securing appropriate housing for my wife and daughter in the Cherokee Territory of Oklahoma." Oklahoma. He'd been planning to send us back to the reservation like unwanted baggage. The silence in the barn was deafening. 23 years of marriage, and I'd never truly known the man I'd shared a bed with. The man I'd just buried had been living a double life, negotiating away our future while kissing me goodnight. I thought I was mourning a husband, but I was really mourning a lie. 23 years of marriage, and he was ready to ship me back to the reservation like damaged goods. When you discover the person you trusted most was your biggest threat, do you grieve the man or the illusion? Running Bear's camp sat in a grove of cottonwoods along the creek, far enough from town to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough for those who needed Cherokee wisdom. I'd ridden here many times as a young woman before marriage taught me to hide that part of myself. Now, clutching the barn documents in a leather satchel, I felt like I was coming home to a part of me I'd almost forgotten. The old man sat by his fire, his weathered hands working a piece of leather with the patience of someone who measured time in seasons rather than hours. His gray braids hung over shoulders that had seen 70 winters, and his dark eyes held the accumulated wisdom of our people. "C.O. Martha," he greeted me in Cherokee, using the name my grandmother had given me. "Do he troubles you?" I spread the documents before him on a blanket, my hands shaking as I explained what I'd found. Running Bear examined each paper carefully, his fingers tracing the government seals and surveyor marks with the reverence one might show sacred objects. "This pattern," he said, finally switching to English so Charles could understand. "I have seen it before. Many times." He pointed to the Bureau of Indian Affairs letterhead. "They question your blood, your right to own land. This is the old game, child. The same one they played with full-blood Cherokee before the removal." Charles leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Running Bear's eyes grew distant. "First, they plant doubt about your legal standing. Then they offer help, relocation assistance, protection from legal troubles. Finally, when you are desperate and confused, they take what was always yours and call it mercy." The pieces began fitting together like a puzzle made of pain. Bose knew this was happening. "Your husband," Running Bear said carefully, "was caught between two worlds. The white world that accepted him because of his skin and the love he bore for you and your daughter. Perhaps he thought cooperation would protect you. By selling our home and shipping us to Oklahoma." Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, studying the flames. "There is something else you must know. 3 other mixed-blood families in this county have received similar visits from land developers. The Hernandez family near the river, the Johnsons who run the trading post, and old Samuel Crowfeather's widow. All have Cherokee or Mexican blood. All have been approached about voluntary relocation." My blood chilled. "This isn't just about our ranch." "No, there is a pattern here, a plan to clear this land of anyone who might complicate ownership when the railroad comes through." He gathered the papers and handed them back to me. "But Martha, you have something they did not expect." "What's that?" His old eyes sparked with something that might have been pride. "You have Cherokee blood that remembers how to fight, and you have these documents that prove their intentions. Most importantly, you have a daughter who belongs fully to neither world, which means she can move freely in both." As the sun set, painting the cottonwoods gold and crimson, Running Bear spoke the old words over a small ceremony fire. He burned sage and sweetgrass, calling on the spirits of our ancestors to guide and protect us. The smoke rose straight up in the still evening air, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the strength that comes from remembering who you truly are. "Be careful, CO," he warned as we prepared to leave. "They have already moved against your family once. They will not hesitate to do so again, especially now that their plans are exposed." The morning after my visit with Running Bear, I rode into town with Charles beside me, the leather satchel of documents secured in my saddlebag. Cedar Creek wasn't much to look at, a single main street lined with weathered buildings, a general store blacksmith shop, and the small church where Bose and I had been married 23 years ago. But it was our community, the place where we'd built friendships and raised our daughter, or so I'd thought. Rosa Morales looked up from arranging bolts of fabric when we entered her general store, her weathered face creasing into a sympathetic smile. "Martha mija," she said, using the Spanish endearment she'd called me for years. "How are you holding up?" "Better than expected," I replied, setting the satchel on her counter. "Rosa, I need to ask you something. Has anyone approached you about selling your store? Anyone from outside town?" Her dark eyes sharpened immediately. "Why do you ask?" Before I could answer, the store's bell chimed, and 3 women entered. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Whitfield, and Sarah Jenkins, all wives of prominent ranchers. Their conversation died when they saw me, and I caught the tail end of Mrs. Patterson's whispered words. Should have expected this kind of trouble. "Good morning, ladies," I said evenly. Mrs. Patterson's smile was as thin as paper. "Martha, dear, we heard about your difficulties. Perhaps it's time to consider what's best for everyone." "What difficulties would those be?" Mrs. Whitfield stepped forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Well, with Bose gone and your situation, it might be wise to accept help when it's offered. There are people who specialize in helping families like yours transition to more suitable arrangements." The words hit me like a slap. Families like mine. "Mixed families," Sarah Jenkins said bluntly. "Face facts, Martha. You're half Cherokee, your daughter's quarter blood, and now you're alone. The law isn't always clear about property rights in cases like these. Better to sell while you can still get a fair price. Rosa's face darkened. That's enough. Martha's family has been part of this community longer than some of you have been in Texas. Has it, though? Mrs. Patterson's mask of sympathy slipped entirely. Really, Rosa, you of all people should understand. Your people came here from Mexico, Martha's came from wherever it is Indians come from. But this is American land now, and American law. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt Charles tense beside me, her hand moving instinctively toward the small knife she carried on her belt. But I placed a gentle hand on her arm, drawing on the strength Running Bear's ceremony had awakened in me. American law, I repeated quietly. The same law that says I'm a citizen, that my marriage was legal, that my daughter has every right to inherit her father's property. I opened the satchel and pulled out one of the documents. Or the kind of American law that's been meeting secretly with land developers to question my legal standing. Mrs. Patterson's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? I spread the surveyor's map on Rosa's counter. Because this map shows your husband's ranch marked for potential acquisition, too. Seems the Texas Land Development Company isn't just interested in Cherokee land, they want anyone who might complicate their railroad plans gone. The three women exchanged glances, and I saw fear flicker across their faces. But it was quickly replaced by something uglier. You're making wild accusations, Mrs. Whitfield said. Grief can make a person see conspiracies where none exist. Just then, the store door opened with such force it rattled the windows. Samuel Whitmore stepped inside his expensive suit and polished boots, marking him as clearly as if he wore a sign saying outsider. His pale eyes swept the room before settling on me with undisguised contempt. Mrs. Bowes, he said deliberately, using my husband's name instead of my own. I believe we need to talk. Doc Henderson's office sat above the barber shop, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked under our boots. The Scottish physician had delivered Charles Set Bowes's broken arm 3 summers ago, and never once questioned my Cherokee remedies when they worked better than his frontier medicine. If anyone in this town could be trusted, it was him. Martha Lass, he said, gesturing us toward chairs in his cramped office. Rosa sent word you needed to speak privately. What's troubling you? I spread the barn documents across his examination table, watching his weathered face grow increasingly grim as he studied each paper. Rosa had followed us up the stairs, and Charles stood guard by the window, watching the street below for any sign of Whitmore or his associates. Sweet mother of God, Doc muttered, adjusting his spectacles. This is worse than I feared. You knew something was happening? He nodded heavily. Aye, but not the scope of it. 3 weeks ago, a man came to see me, said he was conducting a health survey for the territorial government, asked pointed questions about the mental fitness of mixed-blood residents, their ability to manage property, their stability. My blood chilled. What did you tell him? That any man fool enough to question the mental fitness of Martha Crowfeather could take his survey and shove it where the sun doesn't shine? His Scottish accent thickened with anger. But Martha, there's more. He wasn't just asking about you. He had a list: Rosa's family, the Johnsons, old Samuel's widow, even the Henderson boy who's half Comanche. Rosa leaned forward. They're targeting everyone who isn't pure Anglo, aren't they? Doc nodded grimly. It's systematic. Create doubt about legal standing, question mental competency, then offer assistance in the form of relocation. Meanwhile, the land gets sold to railroad interests at a fraction of its value. I thought about Bowes's secret meetings, his locked barn, his final warning. Doc, did my husband ever speak to you about this? The old physician was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. He came to see me 2 weeks before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I was to give you this. My hand shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in Bowes's careful handwriting. Martha, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've found the barn. I know you must hate me now, but I need you to understand I was trying to protect you and Charles the only way I knew how. Whitmore threatened to have you declared mentally unfit, said mixed-blood women couldn't handle property decisions. He had doctors willing to sign papers, judges ready to rule. I thought if I cooperated, negotiated the sale myself, at least you'd have money and a place to go. I was wrong. I should have trusted your strength instead of fearing their threats. The Cherokee in you is stronger than any of their laws. Fight them, Martha. Fight them with everything you have, and know that I loved you, the real you, not the quiet version I was too scared to protect. Your husband, Bose. Tears blurred my vision, but they weren't tears of grief, they were tears of rage. He was trying to protect us by surrendering everything we'd built. Men do foolish things when they're scared, Doc said gently. But Martha, his cooperation gave us something valuable, evidence of their methods, their timeline, their weaknesses. Charles turned from the window. Mama, there's a rider coming. Looks like one of Whitmore's men. Rosa stood, her jaw set with determination. Then it's time we stopped meeting in secret and started fighting in the open. Martha, you can't face this alone. She won't have to, Doc said firmly. I've been in this territory for 30 years. I've seen land grabbers come and go, and I've learned that they only succeed when communities let fear divide them. But when people stand together, he smiled grimly. Well, that's when interesting things happen. I looked around the room at these unlikely allies, a Scottish doctor, a Mexican shopkeeper, my mixed-blood daughter, all united by something stronger than the prejudice trying to tear our community apart. What do you need from us? I asked. Doc Henderson grinned. Everything you've got, lass, because we're not just saving your ranch, we're saving the soul of this town. The next 3 days passed in a blur of careful preparation. Doc Henderson's office became our headquarters, with Rosa translating documents into Spanish for the Mexican families, Charles riding out to warn the scattered ranchers, and me organizing the evidence that would either save our community or see us all driven from our homes. By Thursday morning, we had compiled a devastating case. The surveyor maps showed a clear pattern. Every property marked for acquisition belonged to families with Mexican Cherokee or other non-Anglo heritage. The correspondence revealed a systematic plan to question legal standings, create doubt about mental competency, and force sales at below-market prices. Most damning of all were the Bureau of Indian Affairs documents that attempted to retroactively challenge property rights based on blood quantum, a legal concept that would render half the frontier families homeless if allowed to stand. It's brilliant in its cruelty, Doc observed, spreading the papers across his examination table. They're using our diversity against us, turning the very thing that makes this community strong into a legal weakness. Charles looked up from copying witness statements. How many families are we talking about, Mama? I counted on my fingers. 17 that we know of. Maybe more who haven't been approached yet. The scope of it still took my breath away. If they succeed here, they'll use the same methods in every frontier town between here and California. That afternoon, I rode out to Running Bear's camp one final time. The old Cherokee elder listened gravely as I explained our plan for a public confrontation, his weathered hands working a piece of beadwork with meditative precision. You seek justice in the white man's court, he said finally. But remember, CO, their justice is not always our justice. Be prepared for both paths. What do you mean? He set down his beadwork and looked at me with eyes that held the wisdom of 7 decades. The territorial judge who will hear your case, he is a fair man, but he is also a white man in a white man's world. If his justice fails, you must be ready to seek Cherokee justice. And what would that look like? Running Bear smiled, and for a moment I glimpsed the young warrior he must have been. It would look like a Cherokee woman who refuses to be moved no matter what papers they wave or what threats they make. Sometimes the greatest act of justice is simply refusing to surrender. He performed a brief ceremony burning sage and sweetgrass while speaking words in Cherokee that seemed to call strength from the very earth beneath our feet. As the smoke rose into the darkening sky, I felt the presence of my ancestors' Cherokee women who had faced removal, who had hidden in mountains, who had fought with quiet determination for the right to exist in their own homeland. Friday morning brought unwelcome visitors. I was in the kitchen preparing for the community meeting when Charles burst through the door, her face flushed from hard riding. Mama, they're here. Whitmore and 2 men from the territorial capital. They've got official papers, and they're demanding to see you. Through the window, I could see 3 men in expensive suits standing beside a fancy buggy. Whitmore's pale eyes were fixed on our house with the intensity of a predator studying prey. One of his companions held a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained legal documents designed to strip away everything Bose and I had built. "Let them come," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "But they're not setting foot inside this house. If Samuel Whitmore wants to talk, he can do it on my porch in the open air where the whole community can hear." Charles grinned fiercely. "You want me to ride for Doc and Rosa?" "No need, look." I pointed toward the road where a small procession of riders was approaching Doc Henderson, Rosa, and her eldest son, the Johnson family, from the trading post, even old Samuel Crowfeather's widow on her ancient mare. Word had spread, and our allies were gathering without being called. I stepped onto the porch, my spine straight and my Cherokee blood singing with the strength of generations. The confrontation I'd been dreading and preparing for was finally here, and I was no longer the quiet, grateful woman who had buried her husband a week ago. I was Martha Crowfeather, daughter of Cherokee warriors, and I was ready to fight. The sun stood directly overhead when Samuel Whitmore stepped onto my porch, his polished boots clicking against the weathered boards like a death march. Behind him, his two associates flanked the steps, one a thin man with wire spectacles who clutched a leather satchel, the other a broad-shouldered enforcer whose hand rested conspicuously near his gun belt. "Mrs. Bose," Whitmore said deliberately, using my husband's name again. "I believe we have business to conclude." "My name is Martha Crowfeather," I replied, letting the Cherokee name ring across the yard where my neighbors sat on horseback watching. "And any business between us will be conducted in the open where my community can witness it." Whitmore's pale eyes flicked toward the gathered crowd, Doc Henderson, Rosa, and her family, the Johnsons' old Samuel's widow, even some Anglo families who had decided that justice mattered more than racial prejudice. His confident smile faltered slightly. "Very well," he said, pulling a document from his coat. "This is a court order declaring you mentally incompetent to manage property based on testimony from qualified medical professionals. Your late husband signed preliminary agreements for the sale of this ranch to compensate for debts and provide for your care in a suitable facility." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. I heard Rosa's sharp intake of breath, saw Charles's hand move toward her knife. But I felt only the calm strength that Running Bear's ceremony had awakened in me. "Interesting," I said, reaching into my own satchel. "Because I have some documents, too." I held up the surveyor's map. "This shows 17 properties marked for acquisition, all belonging to families with Mexican Cherokee or other non-Anglo heritage. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Whitmore's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." I pulled out the correspondence. "These letters detail your systematic plan to question the legal standing of mixed-blood families, create doubt about their mental competency, and force sales at below-market prices, all to clear the land for railroad development." Doc Henderson urged his horse forward. "And I have testimony that this man attempted to bribe me into signing false medical evaluations, questioning the mental fitness of half the families in this county." The thin man with spectacles stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should reconsider—" "Shut up, Morrison!" Whitmore snapped, his composure cracking. "These people have no legal standing. Half-breeds and foreigners can't own American land." The silence that followed was electric. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, Rosa Morales spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built a life through sheer determination. "I've been an American citizen for 12 years, senor. My store pays taxes to this county, and my sons will fight for this country if called upon." "What makes you more American than us?" Old Samuel's widow urged her mare closer. "My Cherokee husband served as a scout for the army. He bled for this land. You want to tell me his sacrifice means nothing because of the color of his skin?" One by one, voices rose from the crowd. Stories of service, of building, of belonging. The thin man with spectacles was backing away, now clearly recognizing that the legal ground beneath their scheme was crumbling. Whitmore pulled out a pistol, his mask of civility finally dropping completely. "This land belongs to Americans, not savages and mongrels." The enforcer reached for his gun, but Charles was faster. Her knife flew through the air, pinning his hand to the porch railing. He screamed and dropped his weapon, blood seeping between his fingers. "That's enough," Doc Henderson's voice boomed across the yard. Whitmore, you're outnumbered 20-1, and your legal case just fell apart the moment you drew that gun. I suggest you and your associates mount up and ride out of here while you still can." Whitmore looked around wildly, realizing that his carefully laid plans had collapsed into chaos. The community he'd tried to divide through fear and prejudice had instead united against him. His gun wavered as he faced not individuals he could intimidate, but a collective force that refused to be moved. "This isn't over," he snarled, backing toward his buggy. "Yes, it is," I said quietly, "because we're not going anywhere, and now everyone knows what you tried to do here." 3 days later, Judge William Morrison arrived from the territorial capital with an official ruling that made our victory complete. The elderly jurist, no relation to Whitmore's nervous associate, read the decision from Doc Henderson's porch while the entire community gathered in the street below. "After reviewing the evidence presented," he announced in a voice that carried the authority of frontier law, "this court finds the attempted property seizures to be fraudulent, the medical evaluations to be falsified, and the racial challenges to property ownership to be without legal merit. All affected families retain full ownership of their lands, and the Texas Land Development Company is hereby banned from conducting business in this territory." The cheer that rose from the crowd could have been heard 3 counties over. Rosa Morales wept openly, her weathered hands pressed to her heart. The Johnson family embraced each other, their trading post secure. Even the Anglo families who had stood with us smiled with genuine relief. They understood now that justice delayed for some eventually becomes justice denied for all. That evening, our ranch became the center of a celebration unlike anything Cedar Creek had ever seen. Doc Henderson brought his fiddle, Rosa contributed 3 pots of her famous pozole, and the Johnson family arrived with enough cornbread to feed half of Texas. Old Samuel's widow, Mary Crowfeather, surprised everyone by producing a jug of Cherokee ceremonial wine that her late husband had been aging for a special occasion. "If this isn't special enough," she declared with a grin that took 20 years off her weathered face, "then I don't know what is." As the sun set, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, I found myself standing on the porch where just days ago I had faced down Whitmore's threats. Now that same space was filled with laughter music and the sound of children playing games that mixed Cherokee Mexican and Anglo traditions into something entirely new and entirely ours. Charles appeared beside me, her arm slipping around my waist. "Papa would be proud, Mama." I thought about Bose's letter, his misguided attempt to protect us through surrender. "He would be, but not for the reasons you might think. He'd be proud that we found a better way, not his way, not Whitmore's way, but our way." Running Bear had ridden in for the celebration, his presence adding a spiritual dimension to our victory. He sat by the fire, sharing stories with the children in a mixture of Cherokee and English, weaving together the threads of our different cultures into a tapestry of belonging. "Sio," he called to me using my Cherokee name. "Come sit. The fire wants to hear your story." I joined the circle, feeling the warmth of the flames on my face and the warmth of community acceptance in my heart. "What story would you have me tell?" "The story of a Cherokee woman who remembered how to fight," he said simply. "The story of a community that chose unity over fear. The story of how the old ways and the new ways can walk together when people have courage." As I began to speak, telling the tale of locked barns and hidden documents of legal battles and community solidarity, I realized that this story would become part of the oral tradition of our little corner of Texas. Children would hear it around fires for generations to come, learning that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to be moved. Doc Henderson struck up a lively tune on his fiddle, and Rosa began teaching the Anglo children a Mexican folk dance while Mary Crowfeather showed them Cherokee hand games. The sight filled me with a joy so profound it felt like prayer, this mixing and blending of cultures, this celebration of differences that made us stronger rather than weaker. Later, as the last guest departed and Charles helped me clean up, I walked once more to the barn that had started it all. But now, instead of secrets and shadows, it held only hay and farming equipment, the honest tools of honest work on land that truly belonged to us. I touched the doorframe and whispered a Cherokee blessing for the home we had saved and the community we had built. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, and I smiled, knowing that some things, the land, the sky, the bonds between people who choose to stand together, could never be bought, sold, or stolen. They could only be honored, protected, and passed down to the next generation. 1 month later, I stood on my porch at sunrise, watching the mist rise from the creek that bordered our land. The same creek where my Cherokee ancestors had once camped, where I had gathered healing herbs as a young bride, where Running Bear still came to perform the old ceremonies. But everything else had changed, transformed by the simple act of refusing to disappear. The barn that had once held Bose's secrets now housed a different kind of gathering. 3 mornings a week, I taught reading and writing to the Mexican children whose families worked the surrounding ranches. 2 afternoons, I shared Cherokee herbal medicine with anyone willing to learn. And every Sunday, our porch became an informal courthouse where neighbors brought disputes to be settled with wisdom rather than violence. Charles emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, her movements confident and purposeful. At 28, she had grown into the kind of woman who could gentle a wild horse in the morning and negotiate a business deal in the afternoon. The mixed heritage that had once made us targets now made us bridges between worlds that desperately needed connecting. "The Hendersons are moving their cattle through our south pasture today," she said, settling beside me on the wooden bench Bose had built years ago. "And Rosa got word that another family's looking to settle near the trading post, refugees from some trouble down in Mexico." I nodded unsurprised. Word had spread throughout the territory about Cedar Creek, the little community where different peoples had stood together against those who would divide them. We'd become a beacon for families seeking not just land, but belonging. "What do you know about them?" I asked. "Mixed family like us. Apache mother, Spanish father, 3 children. They heard about what we did to Whitmore, figured this might be a place where they could put down roots without having to hide who they are." The irony wasn't lost on me. A year ago, I had been the one hiding, diminishing myself to fit into someone else's idea of acceptable. Now, families were seeking us out because we had learned to celebrate rather than conceal our complexity. Doc Henderson rode up the path, his medical bag bouncing against his horse's flank. At 72, he still made house calls throughout the county, but these days he often brought me along. My Cherokee remedies combined with his Scottish training had proven remarkably effective at treating everything from fever to heartbreak. "Morning, ladies," he called, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose bones remembered too many frontier winters. "Martha, I've got news from the territorial capital." My heart quickened. Even now, good news from government sources felt like a minor miracle. "Judge Morrison wants to establish a formal mediation program," Doc continued, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "He's asking if you'd be willing to train other communities in conflict resolution. Seems our little victory has inspired some folks to try solving their problems with talking instead of shooting." I looked out over the land that had nearly been stolen from us, at the community that had nearly been divided, at the future that had almost been decided by men who saw us as obstacles rather than neighbors. Now we were being asked to teach others how to transform fear into strength, division into unity. "What would that involve?" I asked. "Travel mostly. A week here, a week there, sharing what you've learned about bringing different peoples together. The territorial government would pay expenses and—" He paused, grinning. "They want to call you the first official Cherokee-Anglo community liaison for the Texas territory." Charles laughed out loud. "Mama, you'd have a government title. Can you imagine what Whitmore would say?" I could imagine, and the thought filled me with a fierce joy. Samuel Whitmore had tried to erase me by questioning my legal standing, my mental capacity, my right to exist in my own homeland. Instead, he had awakened something in me that no amount of paperwork could contain, the knowledge that I was exactly who and where I was supposed to be. "I'll do it," I said, and the words felt like a prayer of gratitude to all the Cherokee women who had fought and survived so that I could stand here on this porch in this moment, speaking these words. Running Bear had been right. Sometimes the greatest act of justice is simply refusing to surrender. But I had learned something more. Sometimes the greatest act of healing is helping others find their own strength to stand. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and possibility, I felt the presence of my ancestors, not as ghosts haunting the past, but as guides lighting the path forward. The barn door stood open, no longer guarding secrets, but welcoming anyone brave enough to seek truth. The land stretched out before us, secure in our ownership and rich with promise. And I, Martha Crowfeather, daughter of Cherokee warriors and mother of the future, was finally completely home. In the end, the greatest treasures aren't found in locked barns or hidden safes. They're discovered in the courage to reclaim your own voice, the strength to stand with your community, and the wisdom to know that some battles are worth fighting, not for what you might win, but for who you become in the struggle. Martha Crowfeather learned that being half of two worlds doesn't make you incomplete, it makes you a bridge. And sometimes the world needs bridges more than it needs walls. This is more than a story about land rights or racial justice in the Old West. It's about the moment when a woman stops apologizing for her existence and starts celebrating her power. It's about communities that choose unity over division, even when division seems easier. Most of all, it's about remembering that the strength of your ancestors flows through your veins, waiting for the moment you're brave enough to claim it.